Hello, everyone. Good evening, and thank you for joining us tonight for our Alternatives to Lawn webinar. And we're so excited for all of you to be here with us tonight and learn how to transform your lawn from turfgrass to native landscapes. This webinar is co-hosted by Snohomish Conservation District and the City of Lake Stevens. And I've got some amazing people here with me tonight. My name is Danny Dewar. I'm a outreach and events coordinator for Snohomish Conservation District. I also have Paisley Blume with me, who is also part of Snohomish Conservation District, and Taylor, who's part of the City of Lake Stevens. So before we get started with the webinar, let's just go over some technical things. Um, so on the next slide, it's going to explain how you use the question and answer button. So on the very bottom, if you look, there should be a question and answer button. You can definitely click that. If you have any questions, type them in. And throughout the presentation, we will be answering these questions. So don't worry, your questions will be answered. And also, if you do need closed captions, there is a option for that as well. So you would just go ahead and click that if you want closed captions with your presentation. And we are recording this class, of course. So we ask that you fill out this pre-workshop survey. It's very quick, and it just gives us an idea of how much you know about stormwater before you participate in this presentation. And then we have a post-workshop survey as well afterwards. But if you could, I'm going to post the link in the chat that you all can access. But there's also a QR code that you can access as well if that's easier. So there's the link to that survey. So if you could just take a moment to fill that out, maybe we'll wait like, what do you guys think, like a minute or so? Okay. All right, and feel free to keep filling out that survey throughout in case you're not yet finished.
Well, and with that, I think while everyone's sort of starting to fill out their worksheets or their workshop survey, if you will, I'll introduce myself. My name is Paisley, like Danny mentioned. I work at the Snohomish Conservation District, and I am currently the Habitat Restoration Project Assistant and also a Washington Conservation Corps member. And I started with the district back in October of last year. And it's been a wonderful experience, and I'm very excited to continue to work with them through this next year in a new position. But I graduated from UW with a bachelor's in environmental science and resource management. And I also had a specific focus on sustainable forestry and also restoration. And I became sort of involved with restoration work at UW as I got really involved with the Society of Ecological Restoration's native plant nursery. And so that's a little bit of my horticultural background, but just more about me personally. I really enjoy spending time outside. This summer, I took up paddleboarding, which has been a lot of fun and a great way to spend some time with my friends. I also really like to get out and hike and backpack. This is a backpacking trip that I took to Lake Angeles earlier this summer, which was really fun. And yeah, I also really love to cook. I've been also making a lot of kombucha recently, which has been very fun as well. But yeah, it's a little bit about me. And today we're going to cover a huge variety of topics, lots to cover. We're going to start by talking about the behavior change campaign, which Taylor will introduce, and then we're going to jump into talking a little bit about conservation districts, what is our role and how we can support you. And then we're going to front load some more ecology information, talking about native plants, wildlife, and pollinators. And then we're going to sort of wrap that into some of the best management practices for natural gardening and lawn care. And then I'll have a bunch of resources at the end, but there's also many resources sprinkled throughout the entire presentation as well. And so, Taylor, if you want to introduce the behavior campaign and your team, all you.
Thanks, Paisley. Thanks, Danny. Yeah, again, my name is Taylor Pesce. I'm with the City of Lake Stevens with surface water and environmental programs. My one of my roles here, amongst many other things, is education outreach per the MPDS program and the permit that were issued by Ecology. Um, yeah, a lot of work to do and a lot of education to get out to folks. SCD provides a lot of that help. And a great partner with us and trying to provide education outreach for everybody. We can go to the next slide real quick, Danny. Okay, so not a lot of folks are familiar with the I Love Lake campaign or the website. It was started by the Conservation District in the city of Lake Stevens about a decade ago. It's kind of just a resource hub that folks can use to find out information, have resources on things they can do to help protect water quality, and just general education on different practices you can implement in your home. But what's kind of cool today is you're all a part of kind of a kickoff for the I Love Lake Pledge to Protect program. That's part of our behavior change campaign to get information out to folks and hopefully get them to implement these different things. So what it is this: the city's launched a new program called the I Love Lake Pledge to Protect. It's a simple voluntary commitment. The residents choose small, practical actions that together make a big difference for water quality in our environment. The pledge comes directly from our city's requirements under the state's NPDES Phase 2 stormwater permit. This permit requires cities like ours to not only manage stormwater, but to also provide education, stewardship opportunities that help reduce pollution at the source. Everything that happens on our lawns and driveways and streets eventually make its way to the lake, to Lake Stevens. Fertilizers, pesticides, and excess yard waste can wash into the storm drains and streams, adding nutrients that feed algae blooms and harm water quality. By making some different choices, like using fewer chemicals, choosing slow release fertilizers, or embracing natural lawn care, you can directly protect the lake for swimming, fishing, wildlife, and future generations. So how this works, when you sign the pledge, you'll pick from a list of best practices that things like mowing higher, mulching the grass, picking up pet waste, planting native vegetation. And within this, that QR code that's present, you can use that to go and access the site. That then gives you the option to pledge, and then it gives you also some options for different resources for doing these pledges, what we call BMPs, best management practices. It'll has a list of all the things that we and folks within this conservation realm really suggest folks do. And so one of the more powerful things that you can do to help us spread the word by sharing the pledge with your neighbors, friends, and family, especially other Lake Stevens residences. Whether it's a quick conversation, social media posts, or inviting someone to take the pledge with you, every connection multiplies our impact. So, protecting Lake Stevens is a community effort, and the more people that take part, the bigger difference we can make together. So that bit.ly code there is a shorter link to get you to the site, or this QR code. You can take a photo, and that takes you to the Zen City page that pledge is housed in. Yeah, so there's our little campaign to pledge to protect the lake. Appreciate you all joining us today.
That's awesome. Thank you, Taylor. And with that, I will jump into the presentation today. So I want to start just talking a little bit about conservation districts and a little bit about our history. So conservation districts really began in the 1930s following the Dust Bowl era in sort of recognition of this larger need to conserve soil and water. And we're actually a political subdivision of the state government. And we primarily are working with people like farmers, city residents, and then also rural and suburban landowners on a voluntary basis. And an important foundation of what we do is trying to build trust with landowners so that we can help them with their natural resource concerns. Snohomish is one of 45 conservation districts in Washington state, but there's actually around 3,000 CDs in the entire United States. So a lot of us doing this work, very important work. Yeah, I'm excited to share a little bit more about it with you all. So in terms of our role as a conservation district, we provide free technical assistance and financial assistance to land managers in Snohomish County and Camano Island. And that's specific for Snohomish, the conservation district. Like I mentioned, we work with rural and urban residents to improve habitat, soil health, productivity, resiliency, and water quality through best management practices. And our work is really aligned with this behavior change campaign in that way. We have a variety of teams at the Snohomish Conservation District, including the ag team that focuses on things like pasture, weed, mud, and manure management, as well as soil health. We also have our community conservation team that focuses on the low impact development, such as rain gardens, cisterns, and bioswales. And then we also have our habitat restoration team, which of course focuses on habitat restoration, including restoring riparian areas and corridors, working buffers, and then also forestry planning. Our ag team also works on projects that revolve around agricultural resilience and also urban agriculture. And then we also do a lot of work involving youth and also adult education, and this workshop sort of falls under that category. Today, I will be talking about a lot of things, like I mentioned, but I really want to reiterate that we're talking about best management practices in terms of natural yard care and garden care. And these topics of watering, fertilizing, weed management, and sort of just general lawn conversion are going to be the main topics for today. And I've listed just a couple example BMPs under those. So these are really all going to tie back into that behavior change toolkit. I really encourage you to check out the website. It's very thorough and it has a whole list of BMPs, many of which I'll touch on today. But just to sort of ground us in topics, this is what we'll be talking about. Let's start by talking a little bit about native plants and why I consider planting them in the first place. Sort of a textbook definition of native plants is that they're ones that have been growing in a specific area prior to colonization. But I don't think that's the most effective definition because it doesn't really tell us a lot about the role of native plants in our environment. So how I typically define a native plant is ones that have evolved and adapted to our local environment for thousands of years, and that they're a very important part of our local habitat and our ecosystems, and that they provide ecosystem services. And that can look like pollination, infiltration, carbon sequestration, and a million other things, just to name a few. But they are also the most sustainable plants for our very specific localized area. And so they're not only adapted physically, but also chemically and genetically to thrive in our specific ecosystems and environment. One of the biggest benefits of planting native species is that they're already adapted to our conditions. So when we're talking about local conditions, I'm referring to things like climate, so rainfall patterns, precipitations, and soil types is another example of that. These plants have, again, evolved over thousands of years to thrive in a very specific amount of soil, moisture, nutrients that are available in the specific region that they have evolved. So because of that, they typically don't need things like fertilizers or irrigation once they're established. This can take a couple of growing seasons, but typically they are going to be more resilient to things like drought as well. And because they don't really require as much sort of additional help like fertilizer and irrigation, this makes them lower maintenance and also more resilient during things like hot and dry summers, which is becoming increasingly common with climate change as well. So in some technical terms as well, native species have also very deep and fibrous root systems that are really efficient at capturing things like water and stabilizing soil. And that is part of the reason that they can be more drought tolerant, but they can also provide other benefits like reducing erosion. So really, by planting natives, you're helping save water and you're also creating more healthy landscapes at the same time. Something else that I always like to talk about with native plants is that they are the foundation of our local food webs because they have evolved also alongside all of our native insects, birds, mammals, and wildlife. So they're providing the right kinds of nectar and seeds and fruits and shelter that wildlife need to survive all year, not just in one season. And we'll talk about that a little bit more. An example of this is native flowering plants that support native bees and butterflies by just blooming at the right time for pollination. So we have like our native salmonberry and service berries, for example, that birds and small animals will feed on kind of in the early summer. It's just sort of an example of that timing. Studies have also shown that native plants support significantly more insect biomass than non-natives because of these specific adaptations. And this is really important because around 96% of North American terrestrial birds feed on insects in order to reproduce. So because there's that sort of correlation between native plants and supporting insects, that's something really important to consider, especially if you're someone who loves birds or bugs. So jumping in a little bit more, when you're considering planting, there's some things that you want to take into consideration before you even think about what plant. Um, so understanding your local climate and also the unique conditions on your property is sort of the first step in cultivating a native landscape. So considering environmental factors that such as soil, this includes type and condition. Um, Type being something more, you have more sandy soil, do you have more clay-based soil? And conditions is going to refer more to whether it's very wet or very dry. You'll also want to take into consideration your sunlight availability and water availability. Sunlight is just going to refer to sort of a full, partial, or sort of low sun. This might be impacted if you have a lot of structures already on your property or if you already have a lot of existing vegetation. The aspect, so the direction also that your home or property is facing can also impact sunlight availability. Same sort of goes for water as well, and this really ties into soil. Something you also want to consider for water is how willing you are to irrigate. Ideally, with native plants, you won't have to irrigate much, but if you are planting species in drier soil because you really like them, you may have to consider irrigating them if your soil is not typically wet or if you don't get a lot of precipitation. So just things to consider. I also like to add on tolerances on here. I've done a few presentations for specifically like Camano Island, and so they're very concerned with things like wind and salt. So another thing to consider is your very local environment. Are you getting, you know, a lot of wind? Are you experiencing a lot of salt spray potentially? And that will really impact what native species you want to plant in your property. So to talk a little bit more about plant phenology, this is that what I was referring to sort of on that first native plant slide, that native plants exhibit a very diverse phenological pattern adapted to their very local environment, and each species has a very specific timing for growth, flowering, and dormancy. And when we think about native plants, they are very synchronized with the region's very specific climate. So like I mentioned, that includes rainfall, temperature, and then climate patterns. And flowering natives are also going to be coupled with our native pollinator cycles. Compared to non-natives and ornamentals, oftentimes they're only providing resources during one season of the year, and typically that's going to be spring or summer. Their growing season often starts earlier, and then they have sort of an advantage over the resources within a specific ecosystem, and that can really alter habitat structure. And then you have that mismatch between flowering and when pollinators are actually needing those resources in order to survive and reproduce. So to put this into sort of a beautiful slide with lots of pictures, creating a more diverse landscape of native plants provides year-round resources. And when we're thinking about how to steward our properties, providing year-round resources is a great place to start. So this is specifically when you're trying to benefit things like wildlife and pollinators, you can be really strategic in choosing which plants will provide food, shelter, and structure throughout not only the growing season, but even into fall and winter. In my personal opinion, also, it really creates a more beautiful garden to enjoy throughout the year rather than just having a few varieties that only bloom sort of at one time. You can kind of create a really diverse, like beautiful timeline where you're having things bloom and produce berries and then also like go dormant all at different times. And you can get really beautiful coloration going and just get kind of creative with your gardening as well. So um, yeah, usually we can see Danny how it works, but usually I also like to say if you want to drop in the chat if you have a really favorite species as an early season or a late season bloomer. I'll share mine. One of my favorite early season bloomers is the oso berry, which is featured here on this slide. To me, it's a plant that always like kicks off spring. The moment it starts budding out, I'm like, oh, winter is over, spring is here. And it's a really important plant for some of those early pollinators. And then one of my favorite late species bloomers, this Canadian goldenrod. It's really just a powerhouse when it comes to providing really excellent pollen for our pollinators, of course. And it pairs really beautifully also with asters. So this is just sort of my favorites. If anyone wants to drop any in the chat, if they'd like to share, I'd love to hear. Something I always want to talk about too is balancing the natives and non-natives in your yard because lawn conversion can be a lot to take on all at once. Sort of a rule of thumb is when you're trying to balance these natives and non-natives is to think about your ratio of 70 to 30, 70 being 70% native plants. And when you're choosing non-natives or ornamental plants, you can also consider ones that also provide ecosystem services and have benefits. Things to stay away from might include plants like that are highly hybridized because they tend to produce less pollen and nectar. So they're really not providing a lot of benefit for our pollinators. However, there are some beneficial non-natives. A lot of these are going to be in sort of our herb and vegetable species. A few include lavender, rosemary, and basil. Um, and then it's also wonderful to avoid non-natives and invasive species. I have a few listed here at the bottom. Butterfly bush is one that sort of is very kind of a misnomer because it doesn't really provide a lot of benefits to butterflies, unfortunately. It doesn't provide very nutritious nectar for them. Other species to avoid are things like common holly, English ivy, and then other invasive species. I'm not going to talk about invasive species much during this webinar, but please consider seeking help if you are dealing with a lot of invasive species. This is a great area where conservation districts can provide a lot of resources. So feel free to reach out if you need some more advice or resources on that. So let's jump into talking a little bit more about lawns and specifically traditional turfgrass lawns. So this term of lawn was actually coined sort of in the 1700s by landscape designers in Europe, primarily England and France. And they were really sort of strictly for wealthy folk because the amount of maintenance that's actually required in order to keep your lawns green and luscious throughout the year. So lawns sort of made their way to the United States in the early 1800s when President Thomas Jefferson was actually considered the first person to ever bring a lawn to America at his Monticello estate. And that sort of trend, escalated, and here we are now. We actually, in North America alone, have an area the size of Washington State that is just lawn. So as you can see, it really took off. And lawns are also another fun fact for you, they require 3 times more irrigation than all of our corn crops in the United States as well. So there's a lot of water and maintenance that goes into lawns. In fact, Americans also purchase around 75 million pounds of pesticides each year in order to maintain their lawns and kill the weeds that might be in their lawn. And those pesticides can move into our local waterways and really impact both terrestrial and aquatic wildlife. So this is really just to say that in terms of pesticides, watering, and then also just labor of mowing, a lot of people are moving away from traditional lawns because of all that maintenance that's required. Something else that's important to think about in terms of, clicked a little too fast. Important to think about in terms of lawns is that they're considered a biological desert. And this just refers to an environment that when the biological productivity and diversity is very low. So you can imagine in a lawn, you really don't have a huge diversity of species, and it's not really providing benefits to things like wildlife or pollinators. So that's sort of when we enter that biological desert sort of zone. And turfgrass and other low growing varieties of grass really just form thick carpet-like surfaces, which can actually contribute to runoff because their root systems aren't really holding or filtering water very well. So it's something to consider when you're kind of adding a lot of pesticide and herbicide and fertilizer for that matter. And then you're watering that a lot, but it's not really holding or filtering that water. You can imagine that that's really moving a lot of those chemicals through our environment. What I want to talk about next is the concept of habitat connectivity. Habitat connectivity is essentially maintaining sort of biodiversity and also supporting ecological processes that can help species sort of adapt to climate change and also can reduce issues with wildlife collisions as well. These maps here are supposed to sort of just indicate and show how roadways and areas of really high urbanization can impact access to different green spaces. And that can lead to what we call habitat fragmentation, which is essentially when human-made infrastructure impacts of climate change can impact things like wildlife and their ability to access the resources that they need. That impact to wildlife can be things like increased collisions, like I mentioned, but also reduced genetic diversity, and then also just general loss of habitat area and also the quality of that habitat. So you can imagine that something, again, like a lawn isn't providing a really high quality habitat because it's not providing some of those very fundamental resources like water, food, and shelter that wildlife need. During this presentation, we're going to be really focusing on how to create more of that connectivity. So there's sort of two scales that you can think about. This sort of larger scale is you can think about wildlife corridors as creating that transition between large green spaces. The I-90 Wildlife Bridge is an example of a way to create connectivity, but on sort of a landscape scale. But the purpose of this presentation, we're going to talk more about sort of that mosaic of creating stepstones for wildlife and how we can create connectivity through the stewardship of our gardens and green spaces with native plants. So we've been talking a lot about wildlife and how to support them. So I think it's important to just talk about first, what are the very fundamental needs of wildlife? I've sort of hinted at this, but to say it more blatantly, wildlife requires food, water, cover, and safety. And that safety can refer to sort of a place where they can raise their young and reproduce. And we're going to be touching on how to support each aspect of these wildlife needs throughout the presentation. But something I want you to be thinking about as we go through this webinar is the question of who are you trying to attract, especially if you are somebody that really loves wildlife and wants to bring them more into their green space. This is a really important question because this will directly inform what actions you're taking on your property in terms of native plants that you're trying to bring into your space, but also in terms of your day-to-day actions. Sort of Taylor mentioned this as well in the behavior campaign. Mission is just how can we change our day-to-day actions to support our natural resources, and wildlife is definitely included in that. So just to talk a little bit about, the wildlife that we have here in the Puget Sound, we are very abundant in a huge diversity of types of wildlife. Obviously I have these photos here, but we can also think about, what are the benefits of having wildlife in your green spaces and what are sort of their ecological roles. So a big one is something like seed dispersal. Think about birds. A lot of species of native wildlife will also eat less favorable insects and pests, things like mosquitoes, which I could definitely use of less of. So something to consider. Other sort of native species will also prune and modify woody stems. I think our busy beaver here is the best example of that and how they can really change a landscape in a really unique way. They're also really involved in sort of the process of nutrient cycling and also creating habitat for other wildlife. Again, the beaver is a great example of creating that habitat. In fact, one of a project that I was working on a while ago, it was very cool. We were working on a beaver dam and we actually found an amphibian egg sac inside the beaver dam. And I think that was just a really cool example of the way in which wildlife can support other wildlife by creating more habitat specifically for, the needs that they have. So in this case, it was, reproduction, and that was really a really cool and special experience for me. This is another spot. If anyone has any cool wildlife stories or like to share any wildlife that they've seen in their yard, feel free to drop it in the chat. I always love to hear a good wildlife story. So let's jump into talking a little bit more about pollinators and the importance of them. I think no one is here probably in this webinar doesn't think that pollinators are unimportant, but I always like to have this slide to really lay out how incredibly valuable pollinators are to environment and how they really are a linchpin in terms of ecosystem services. So the main thing that pollinators are doing is supporting plant reproduction. So pollinators are essential partners in plant reproduction. When things like bees, butterflies, and birds and other pollinators visit flowers for nectar or pollen, they're also helping transfer that pollen or nectar in between flowers. So this fertilization allows plants to produce seeds and fruit. And this is how often a lot of plants actually are reproducing and spreading. So without pollinators, plants simply wouldn't be able to complete their life cycle. So that's a very foundational and important aspect of pollinators. And this transportation of pollen is essentially almost like pollinators are acting as like sort of couriers, which is kind of cool, where they're moving this pollen and supporting these natural systems as well, because oftentimes things like wind and water, which can also move pollen, is not is just not enough in order for native plants to be successful. So that's something very important to consider. And native pollinators are also increasing the diversity of plant life, sort of in the same vein of supporting plant reproduction. In terms of our food systems, pollinators actually are huge proponents of supporting our food systems. Around 35% of our food is actually dependent on pollination, and that stat is from the Food and Agricultural Organization. So without pollinators, crop yields would drop, food prices would rise, and also nutrition in general declines because we're having that lack of diversity. So protecting our pollinators is actually really closely related to also protecting our food supply as well. A really interesting study by Losey from 2006 was actually indicated that wild insect pollinators are providing around $3 billion in pollination services. And just to put that in context, I mean, that's 2006. So you can even imagine now that number is probably even larger. So pollination is important ecologically, but it's also very valuable economically as well. And I also like to point out that that is just from wild insects pollinators as well. So that's not even counting sort of our managed honeybee hives as well. So if we're losing our native pollinators, the losses would be really profound. So it's very important to consider how we can support them. Another stat that I always like to bring up is that 85% of our flowering plants are pollinator dependent. So that goes back to that plant reproduction. 85% of our native flowering plants rely on animals like bees, butterflies, moths, bats, and birds for pollination. So they are really the main engine of reproduction in our plant world. In Washington, we are very lucky to have a huge variety of pollinators. Unfortunately, all of them are impacted by things like climate change and habitat fragmentations, which is why it's so important to have webinars and outreach events like this so that we can talk about how important they are and then also how to support them. So in Washington, let's see, we have over 600 bee species, including the native mason bees, sweat bees, and carpenter bees, as well as leafcutter bees, which are very cool. In terms of butterflies, we have around 150 species, such as the western tiger swallow, the anise swallowtail as well, and the woodland skipper, and the painted lady is another beautiful one. And then we boast almost, I think, actually over 1,000 moth species, which is a lot of moths, but they're also important pollinators. One of my favorites is the hummingbird clearwing moth because it's really big and crazy to look at. So I encourage you to look it up. But these insects are really attracted to bright colors and also very nectar-rich flowers. So that's something to consider if you like butterflies and moths. Hummingbirds, we have the Anna's and Rufus hummingbird. And they are really attracted to tubular flowers, things like columbine, and also pestemon is another species that they like. But then we have a lot of other insects, things like wasps, flies, beetles, and bats as well as another one that people forget. Our desert bat is a pollinator and native here in Washington. So on the topic of pollinators, I always like to talk about pollinator meadows. They are, as the name suggests, great at supporting pollinators. These sort of areas are typically found in really sunny areas, and they can promote biodiversity. A lot of the species that grow within meadows are ones that really prefer full sun. And depending on the area that you have, you can really have a huge amount of variety in terms of the species that can exist within those meadow spaces. Pollinator meadows are essentially naturally managed or intentionally planted areas that are designed to specifically support pollinators. And these spaces typically have sort of a mix of wildflowers and grasses, and that can provide both food in terms of nectar and pollen, but also shelter for pollinators as well. And they're great things to add into our space. And there is really actually a huge decline in the loss of meadow space due to things like urbanization. And so it's a really great feature if you have a really sunny area to add. And we'll talk a little bit about how to do that. And compared to traditional lawns, they store more carbon, and they're very low maintenance in terms of implementing them because they only require mowing theoretically once a year. However, I know people that don't ever mow their pollinator meadows as well. So varying degrees of, how much effort you want to put in, but mowing one time a year even is a lot better than mowing every week, for example. They also are great at improving water infiltration, and they're also very drought tolerant. And if you want to learn more about pollinator meadows, the Snohomish Conservation District has um, sort of an article about them. It's just called Benefits of Native Meadows, and it's on our website. So feel free to check that out. In terms of creating a pollinator meadow, it's very easy. I would first direct you to check out Northwest Meadowscapes. They're a great local company. They provide things like seed packs, and you can get individual species, but you can also get sort of a mixed native seed pack as well. They also have really just wonderful resources to learn and read more about the benefits of pollinator meadows. And you can really get into the nitty gritty too about, reading about all these different types of, grass species and wildflower species. So if that's something you're interested in, definitely check out Northwest Meadowscapes. They also have a strong emphasis on sustainability and sustainable harvesting of their seeds, which I think is really cool as well. In terms of when to start your pollinator meadow, the best would be to sow your seeds in the fall or spring. Having soil contact with those seeds, rather, having soil contact is really going to increase your likelihood of germination. So considering that when you're sowing your seeds. However, I've also known people that have just tossed seeds out and they've actually come up, but you might have just increased your likelihood of germination if you are more intentional about making sure those seeds actually make soil contact. Also, I would consider when you're sowing them to give it a good water just to help with that establishment. Like I mentioned, native plants are very drought tolerant typically, but when they're first getting established, it is important to make sure that they have an abundance of like those vital resources. So consider watering. But yeah, and again, mostly sun-loving species. So really consider that when you're thinking about where pollinator meadow might fit into your landscape. So at this point, I'd like to take a quick pause and ask Danny, are there any questions in the chat? We're about halfway through.
It looks like right now we do not have any questions, but now would be a good time if anyone has any questions for Paisley to put it in the chat or in the question and answer section, and we can take a quick pause maybe for a few seconds to see.
Or were there any cool wildlife stories or anything like that?
No, none posted thus far.
That's all right. That's okay.
I think we just have a very rapt crowd. You're very thorough, so maybe they don't have questions because you're answering them as you go.
Well, hey, that's good. If they do come up. Oh, we have a raised hand. That's exciting.
Ooh, okay. Hello, Bruce. Let's see. Are you able to type your question in the question and answer, please? Let's cover this one while Bruce might be typing. Aaron asks, how much space is needed to make a beneficial pollinator meadow? It's a good question.
That's a great question. I think that something is better than nothing, just as like a general sort of rule. Like I think if you're making an attempt and you don't have a huge amount of area, I wouldn't let that stop you from trying and from planting and sowing some seeds. But I think it's sort of hard to say. I would say you could even I don't know, the smaller you go, the less sort of benefits it's providing because you just have less resources. So I would say maybe anything under like 300. Well, no, I don't think there's any size that's too small. It's too small to provide some benefits. But what I would really focus on is the conditions of where you're planting those seeds. So again, thinking about how much sunlight is available and thinking about if you're able to irrigate while those seeds are going to try to germinate is going to be most beneficial. Even if you have only like even if you just have sort of like a galvanized like tub, almost like a raised garden bed, I think that, or of that kind of area of space, I think that is a great way to start.
Okay, we've got a few more flowing in. Stephanie asks, what if there is fear of it looking messy for a pollinator meadow? Do you recommend certain plants?
That's a great question. I do. I'm gonna get to my plant species recommendation, so I might put that question off because I have a whole slide about it. In terms of it looking messy, I would say nature is messy, and everyone has different tolerances for what they would sort of like in terms of what they want their yard space to look like. And I think if you are worried about sort of that aspect of messiness, maybe reducing the number of species that you have in your pollinator meadow can maybe help with that, and maybe keeping it a little bit more confined to like a specific bed, for example. Like if you have an area of your yard where maybe you'll let nature sort of take over and let it do its thing, but you can sort of confine it to a specific area so that you can still have other areas that are maybe more to your like aesthetic desire, is maybe my consideration for you there. But I promise I will get to species suggestions. I'm just gonna hold off for a second.
Awesome. Thank you, Paisley. And Bruce asks, where can I get native seeds?
Great question. There's many places. Northwest Meadowscapes is going to be my first suggestion for you. Again, they have that focus on like sustainably harvesting those seeds. Um, but there's also other companies as well that are great. I have some suggestions for native plant nurseries sort of at the end of the presentation. Um, but those are going to be more for stock, things like potted stock or maybe even bare roots as well. I believe there's one, I think is called John Humes, that we've bought seeds for before for our plant sale. Hume Seeds, I believe, is another place to consider as well.
Thank you. And Kate asks, how do you feel about guerrilla gardening?
Oh, interesting. I would not encourage anyone to break the law, first of all, but I think that, most landscapes can really benefit from more native plants. I think I'll leave it at that as a government employee.
Thank you, Paisley. All right, I think that's the end of the questions thus far.
Okay, beautiful. Thank you guys for asking your questions. I love to have, interactions with the audience. So feel free to keep brainstorming them, and we'll have another time at the end of the presentation to answer and ask more questions. Cool. Okay, getting into a little bit more of the main sort of the bulk of this presentation, which is the lawn conversion. So I want to start with sort of this framework. And as you'll notice, it's very cyclical. So it's not something that is going to be a straight line. This will be a process, and really just being patient, maybe taking it, one step at a time, but also always knowing that you can sort of continue around. And this, maybe I should put arrows on both directions, actually, I don't know. But typically you're going to want to start by assessing your site, like I mentioned, and thinking about what your goals are. So this is really tying back into your site conditions and asking, what are you trying to do and why? So like, who are you trying to attract? So strategically thinking about your landscape and defining what you want your outdoor space to look like, what wildlife you're trying to attract, and maybe you're trying to provide some more privacy for yourself. So you're going to want to get bigger trees established. So asking yourself all these questions can really help inform the next step, which is to create your plan. So in creating your plan, you'll want to think about what plants you want to see on your property, thinking about, again, all of those site conditions and which species are going to do the best on your site. I'm going to give you a whole load of plant species suggestions. So just thinking about your unique yard conditions and then choosing the right plant and making your plant list, and then also starting to define some areas that you might want to convert from turf grass into more of that native landscape. Yeah, so plan. Plans are always important. You can create a super detailed plan, or you can keep it more simple. I lean on the side of creating a more detailed plan. So thinking about quantities and species, and also spacing of those plants. And again, also the area that you're going to be wanting to work in, and also what's currently in that area. Do you have turf grass? Do you have a different weed species? Is it bare ground? Is it some sort of impermeable surface, like your, I don't know, pathway, for example? So creating your plan, and then you're going to want to prepare your site. So preparing your planting area can mean removing weeds prior to planting, especially if the area is already lawn. You might want to consider a process called sheet mulching, and also removing that sod. We're going to get into both of those in just a couple slides. Let's see, I don't want to get too much into sheet mulching. So yes, preparing your site. We'll talk more about the details of how to do that. And then plant right. So this is sort of the idea of like setting your garden up for success by actually just planting your plants correctly. So that means making sure that your roots have, good spread, that they roots aren't sticking out of the soil, that roots are facing down and not up, or they're not J rooted, which means sort of the root is down and then sort of comes back up in a J shape, making sure that the roots are going the direction they should, which is down and in the ground. And also considering, you don't want to pack your soil in too tightly, but you also don't want it too soft as well. So trying to get that right amount of sort of compaction to make sure that your plants are staying in place. And then also considering irrigating, especially when you're first planting, just to help those plants get established. And planting right can also refer to seasonality. So typically you're not going to want to plant in the middle of summer because it's going to be really hot and your plants are going to have a great chance of survival. So considering fall through spring, early spring, I would say, planting is going to sort of yield the best chances of your plant surviving, which is at the end of the day the goal. And then you want to maintain your planting. So this is going to be thinking about, this is going to entirely depend on what sort of lawn alternative method you choose. But in general, the idea is that native plants require less maintenance than a typical lawn, but it doesn't mean no maintenance. So this can look at like things like potentially some watering and additional mulching in the first few years of establishment, but the main thing is going to be weed control. There are certain methods of lawn conversion that typically yield less weeds. Mulching is one of them, but weeds are hard things to get rid of. That's why there's whole jobs built off of it. And companies and industries and government bodies. So weeds are tough, and it may require some weed pulling from time to time, depending on sort of the seed bank and soil conditions that you have in your yard. And then the last thing is to make adjustments and have a little bit of fun with it too. I think gardening, especially if it's something that you feel a little bit passionate about, can be a lot of fun when you sort of let your creativity shine and incorporate other features into your lawn and experiment with new types of species. And the making adjustments really has to do with, maybe you try something one year and certain things live and certain things die, and maybe you want to replace those things that died. And, you're just always going to have to adapt. It's never going to go perfectly right, but if you have fun with it, it can look pretty awesome throughout the whole process, and you'll get there eventually. Cool. So let's really dive into the big topic, which is how to remove turf grass, how to get rid of that sod. Like I mentioned, plan first. So consider the tools that you need. Renting a sod cutter, which is sort of shown here, it's this green machine in my picture, is something that you can rent or buy. It's probably going to be the most effective tool for you, if especially in terms of like the manual labor, because removing sod is no easy task. But you can also use things like a garden spade or a shovel. They also have this like non-mechanical, this like, or manual rather, sod cutter as well, which can be a little bit maybe more budget friendly, but maybe not as, back friendly, depending on how much sod you're trying to remove. One thing I would really consider when you're removing sod is to do it in sort of phased or sectioned lawn removals. So you can do things like stake out boundaries. That can be with just like things like pin flags. It can be with, really anything you have laying around. You could use sticks, it doesn't matter. But just creating sort of a boundary for the area that you're going to remove the sod can be a really helpful way just to get going. And again, I recommend taking it in smaller chunks and not trying to do a huge area in one go, because it's just going to be frustrating and tiring. And you have to consider that when you're moving that sod, that has to go somewhere. So really think about disposal. This should be a part of your plan. Something you can do is sort of use that sod to your advantage. You can maybe create sort of like a very topography if you want to create like a mound, but likely I imagine you're just going to want to get rid of it. So that might look like composting or some sort of like yard waste removal service. Yeah. And let's see, anything else to talk about for removing sod? I think that's it. Typically you're going to want to go at least like 2 to 3 inches and down into the soil, but what you want to focus on, because different grasses have different root masses, so it's really hard to say, but what you're really after is trying to get rid of as much of those roots as possible, as well as like the surface layer of grass. I also recommend mowing before you do this, because it's just a little bit easier to see and navigate, I think, when the grass isn't super tall. Oh wait, I forgot I had these beautiful pictures in here. This is one of my lovely coworkers' houses. And this is sort of an example of like in process of sheet mulching and removing that sod. So you can see it's going to get a little messy, but gardening is messy, so that's okay. But it can really turn out to be a sort of a great process in the end. So you can see in this top photo is sort of the process of digging and getting that sod up and out of the ground. And then the below picture is an example of mulching. So that's sort of the next topic here that I want to talk to you all about. So sheet mulching is a great thing to do after removing sod. This is going to really help with the likelihood of sort of reinvasion of that grass. If you do nothing after removing sod, likely that grass is just going to come back. Even if you're really thorough about trying to get those roots out, I think the part of like the disturbance of removing the sod is going to sort of invigorate maybe any of the weed seeds that you have in your soil, which is very likely that you do have weed seeds in your soil. So leaving that bare ground is not going to be a great move. So I really recommend following up with planting or sheet mulching. So sheet mulching is a form of like shade control where you first want to have a weed barrier down. So this is going to be covering that bare ground with something like cardboard or newspaper. A lot of people ask me about synthetic fabrics. I wouldn't lean towards them personally. I would lean towards something that is going to decompose over time, because if you think about like that plastic material under your layer of mulch, like it's just not creating very deep soil. Like you're not really amending the soil that is existing underneath that synthetic fabric. Some people do it and it works for them, but I do think you'll have to build up those mulch layers a lot more if you have a synthetic fabric, because you're not really amending anything below it. So I would opt for something more like cardboard or newspaper, but the main goal is that you're trying to keep light off of this bare ground. So a really important tip that I have for you is to make sure that the edges are overlapping from that barrier, because you do not want any light to come through, because that is going to allow any weed seeds to germinate, which is the last thing anybody wants. So you've prepared the area, you've removed the sod, but also some people sheet mulch without removing the sod first. I think you have a higher chance of success of not having grass reinvade and other weeds reinvade if you remove the sod first, but I know a lot of people that have just mulched right on over their grass. So you're going to lay down your weed barrier, and then you're going to lay down your green and brown layers. So this might look like things like grass clippings. It can also look like dried leaves and shredded bark and mulch. And you will likely want at least a few inches of that. And you're going to want to make sure that your green layers are free of any sort of weed seeds as well. So just thinking about where you're getting your resources, or where you're getting your sources from, yeah, and making sure that they're clean in terms of the sense that there's not weed seeds in them. After those green brown layers, you can add compost as well. Compost is a great soil amendment, and then mulch. In terms of compost, you can do around 3 inches, and then your mulch layer, I would say at least another 3. Typically, you just don't want any sort of material that you're adding on top of your weed barrier. You want it to be at least like 6 inches in terms of depth. So there is a little bit of wiggle room in terms of like, what's the perfect ratio of green layers to brown layers to compost to mulch. It's going to be okay. There's a little bit of wiggle room there. You just kind of want to make sure that you're meeting that 6-inch goals, and that you're adding really great organic matter overall. So you're kind of thinking about this almost like as a lasagna, where you're making these different layers and building them up. Something to consider with sheet mulching is that you are increasing the surface, like you're raising the surface of your yard as well. So if that's something that's a concern for you, you might not want to sheet mulch like your entire lawn. Some people prefer to do more of like a garden bed. It's up to you. Something that's great about sheet mulching is that it improves your soil health, because you don't really have to dig. And you are going to be really improving your soil health, because those layers are going to decompose over time. And this might take several months, maybe take years. But as those layers continue to decompose, you're creating new soil. And so you are just increasing that organic matter and increasing the nutrients that are available in the soil, which is going to be hugely beneficial when you follow up with planting as well. In terms of labor and maintenance, the great thing is that if you mulch really well, likely you won't have too many weeds to pull. I don't want to promise there's going to be no weeds because likely there'll be maybe a few, but the main maintenance that you're reducing is things like mowing, watering, fertilizing, and the use of pesticides. So that's a really great benefit. It's also pretty cost effective. For most people, these are not super expensive materials. Of course, the bigger the area, the bigger the cost. But a lot of these materials that I talked about in terms of cardboard, newspaper, and mulch and compost are things that aren't a huge budget wise, and maybe even can source for free as well. So something to consider there. In terms of a characteristic for a good mulch, you'll want to consider something that has somewhat of a coarse texture. For landscaping beds, wood chips, leaf litter and other just like woody contents, sort of like woody material is a really good example. You're gonna want to avoid things like super fine bark, or shredded bark, and also like the blends. They typically have a little bit more of like a waxy sort of fiber, which can be really hard, in terms of like that. It sort of creates like an impenetrable layer, in terms of, that sort of soil health, and we're trying to create like good airflow and moisture and biological activity. So you're just going to want something that's a little bit more coarse so that you have like good airflow and good space for all of that good like biological activity to happen. Arborist chips are something else that I like to talk about. These are a little bit, optional, but they could be great dressing for around like specific trees or mixed shrubs because they can help with that water retention. So it's just sort of another layer, like maybe if you have a really dry landscape, arborist chips might be considered like a good dressing because it can help with that water retention as well. But more so as a dressing as opposed to broadcast putting them everywhere. Cool. Other additions that you can make in your yard, which are really add to sort of the beauty and also the diversity in sort of the landscape, are things like river rock and gravel bed. You can also consider adding things like logs and woody debris, which also are very beneficial in supporting a lot of our native pollinators, especially native bees, because they nest a lot in things like logs and woody debris. And then of course, native plants. It was one of the best additions. So rather than just having, a mulched bed, we want to have plants in there, and you can add sort of that diversity. And adding all of these materials can help disperse things like water runoff and help filter out pollutants as well. And you can really get creative too and create some like really beautiful designs. And yeah, it's a fun way to, spice up your yard a little bit. Sorry, one too far. There we go. Another method of getting rid of grass is something called light exclusion or solarization. Really, the only difference between these two terms is that light exclusion is black plastic, and solarization is considered like when you use clear plastic. But the concept is the same, where you're using essentially like heat, and you're creating sort of like a little heat chamber in order to sterilize the soil, which will kill the grass, which is really great. But the other side of that is that you're also killing everything else, theoretically. So if you have, all of that like all those microorganisms and that bacteria that's in your soil that's, contributing to soil health, like those will also be impacted by this method. But it can be really effective in terms of getting rid of grass, especially if you have maybe really like something like Bermuda grass that is really aggressive and hard to get rid of. This might be something worth considering. I wouldn't suggest, again, using it in a huge area, but maybe if you have an isolated patch of grass that you've been really trying hard to get rid of, maybe this would be a good option for you. This method works really the best in areas with really high summer temperatures, because again, it's that heat component and that trapping of heat that's killing the grass. You'll want to implement this sort of in the spring and then let it work its magic over the summer. Typically, it takes about 4 to 8 weeks. But if you have really, again, aggressive grass, maybe it'll take longer than 8 weeks. This is just sort of that typical range. Before installing the plastic, you'll want to cut the grass very short, and you want to secure the edges, and also avoid making holes, because holes will allow light to come through, especially if you're using light exclusion as your method of getting rid of sod. So these are things to consider. I've also heard that if you water it beforehand, it is more effective, but I haven't seen that with my own eyes personally. But theoretically, if you mow and then water it, I think it's something about kind of creating that like heat dome effect, but I'm not 100% sure about that. So something else another method to consider when trying to remove sod is tilling. So tilling for lawn conversion involves sort of breaking up the soil with a tiller to incorporate organic matter and prepare the ground for planting. So I'd really like to emphasize is that you are going to till, you should absolutely follow up with planting. And if you don't follow up with planting, you are just disturbing the ground and you're waking up all the weed seeds, and then you're going to have a bigger problem on your hand. So this is a great way to remove existing grass and improve soil conditions, but it does need to be followed up with like additional maintenance. Primarily planting is the best thing to do. So in terms of we can break it down. First, you're going to want to remove any obstacles from the area that you want to till. So that means clearing away things like rocks and sticks and debris. You may even mow the area first. And then you'll want to set your tiller depth to sort of an appropriate depth for whatever grass you're dealing with. Typically, that's going to be around 4 to 6 inches for the initial pass. And then you'll also want to make some parallel passes. And these ones can be a little bit more shallow, more like 2 to 3 inches. But you want to be careful not to do too many passes because that can actually lead to soil compaction, which seems a little counterintuitive because you're mixing it up, but it's sort of like a fine line between doing too many and just the right amount. So typically, like I wouldn't go more than like maybe 4 or 5 passes, like at the most. But it also can depend if your soil is already super compact. Maybe you need a little bit more. It's really, yeah, it depends on your site conditions in that way. But after you do your passes, I recommend adding soil amendments to incorporate more organic matter. So that might look like something like compost. I also biochar is another one that people use, but I think compost is probably the most common. And then you'll want to do like a final pass mixing in that soil amendment to really thoroughly mix it into the soil that you've just tilled. And then after you've done your passes, you'll want to rake the area and level off the soil, remove any sort of like remaining debris, especially if that debris is something like roots of like sod and things like that. So once you have that all leveled out and ready to go, planting is going to be your next step. So some of the benefits of tilling, like I mentioned, is it can loosen soil. And so that can do things like improve drainage and aerate your soil as well. And if you incorporate amendments, this is a really great way to just add them in. And that can really enrich your soil and provide more nutrients for when you plant. Again, another benefit is that it does remove grass. It can be pretty effective in terms of being able to establish a new garden without sod. But some things to consider is timing. So fall or early spring is generally recommended for when you want to till, because those are also the times that you can then immediately plant. But winter, I wouldn't recommend winter because it's just likely you're gonna have a lot of you might have frozen ground depending on where you live. So more so spring and fall. And like I mentioned, an issue with tilling is that it can lead to more soil compaction if you do it too excessively, or if the depths are too excessive. So just be cognizant of that. And then there is likely going to be some impact on your soil in terms of maybe breaking up some of those mycorrhizal connections, and the microbes and insects might be impacted by your initial tilling. So that's one of the reasons it's very important to follow up with adding soil amendments and planting, because you are in a way negatively impacting the soil because you're breaking up those connections. And you may also disturb weed seeds. And again, follow up with planting and monitor that area because you may need to do some weed pulling because you are disturbing the ground. Cool. So let's really get into, I feel like I've been talking a lot about weeds, so let's talk a little bit about how to manage them. These are some BMPs that are directly pulled from the Behavior Change Campaign. And so I really want to highlight them. In general, when you are managing weeds, best practice is to avoid herbicides and pesticides when possible. There are times when you need to use herbicides and pesticides, and that's okay. But typically, it's really important to really go through a process of evaluating, is this really necessary, and what are other methods that I can use in order to control these weeds? And some of those methods include things more aligned with like manual control of weeds. So that can be things like pulling weeds, mulching as well, grubbing. And I have some tools shown here on this slide. My favorite one is the bottom. That orange tool is a weed wrench. It's really great for woody stems. Super fun. Things like Scotch broom and holly. It's really great for. Another BMP is to consider only spot treating when it's necessary. So rather than broadcast spraying herbicides or pesticides, being very specific and intentional when you're using them, and delivering it to maybe one specific plant rather than broadcast spraying it over your entire property. And then you can also choose eco-friendly products that are labeled safe for waterways as well. We can give you some more details on this. And I really recommend checking out King County weed control practices. They have BMP forms that are very thorough for almost every single invasive species that you'd find in this area. So highly recommend. All you really need to look up is like King County BMP and then the name of whatever species you're trying to control, like blackberry or knotweed or holly or any of that. If you look that up, you'll get, that's a really great resource. And they're very thorough as well. Cool. A little bit more on weed management is I like to make sure that I always talk about really defining what a pesticide is, because I think there's a bit of a misconception. Pesticides are actually more of an umbrella term. So pesticides include things like insecticides, fungicides, and herbicides. It's not just for things like insects. So that's that umbrella term. And so by reducing your reliance on these harmful chemicals and by supporting diverse systems, then we can actually improve our ecosystem resiliency and also reduce our pest problems. You can be also very intentional when you're planting native plants that are attracting specific insects that actually help control, for example, pests that are causing problems. And that sort of leads me to my question of maybe if anyone could drop in the chat if they happen to know what insect is on this slide here, because it kind of looks like a spooky fella, but maybe he is, maybe he isn't. I don't know. If anyone has a guess, feel free to throw it in the chat while I keep talking for a minute. But yeah, pesticides can have really huge impact on wildlife. In terms of pollinators, it can affect things like their reproduction, navigation skills, and their memories. And it can really impact sort of just the structure of the environment, of course, especially when you're doing broadcast spraying. And that will impact the amount of resources that are available for wildlife. And it can contaminate things like nesting areas and materials. And this is particularly important when we're thinking about our native pollinators who are already really struggling from all of these reasons that we've sort of talked about in terms of like habitat fragmentation and climate change, and just like not favorable conditions. So really important to consider and really just ask yourself very thoroughly, when is it necessary for me to use herbicides and pesticides, and when can I approach this issue in a different way, and consider a less invasive approach potentially, or a less aggressive approach, but still one that's very effective and can get the job done. Danny, did we have any guesses for who this little fella is?
Ooh, I think we do. Let's
Yeah.
see. Stephanie says ladybug. And
Yes.
Margie,
Mhm.
yes, if you want to comment, you can just add it to the question and answer. Chat is disabled. But yes, ladybug.
Yes, it is. It's a ladybug larva. This is one of my favorite ones because it looks so kind of crazy with its little spikes on its back when it's in its larval stage. But actually, the larvae of ladybug are like super ferocious, and even more so than mature like adult ladybugs. And when I worked at the nursery, whenever I saw one of these guys, I was so happy because they eat thrips and aphids like crazy, which is a big problem, especially in like a nursery space. But I'm sure if anyone has any vegetable gardens, I'm sure you've had to deal with thrips and aphids before. So whenever I see one of these guys, I'm always very stoked. Just as a general rule. So being able to also, this kind of goes back to your considerations before even planting, is walking around your yard and seeing like what insects are here, who's already existing in this space, and so what do I need to do as like a steward to this piece of property in order to bring in beneficial wildlife and bring in beneficial insects, and what's already doing the work for me as well. It's so pretty cool. So yes, ladybug larvae, they're awesome. Cool. So now we're going to switch gears a little bit and really jump into, I think I actually skipped a slide. My apologies. We're going to really jump into talking about native plant suggestions. And I just wanted to really quickly talk about rain gardens, because they're very cool landscape features that are specifically designed to collect and absorb rainwater runoff and rather than letting it flow into storm drains. So this is really connected to what the behavior change campaign is about. These gardens are typically planted with native drought tolerance plants. And the feature is sort of like a bowl shaped depression in order to capture water, and has a very specific sort of mix of soil to promote things like infiltration. So some of the big benefits is that it reduces stormwater runoff by collecting and infiltrating that rainwater. It can help with things like preventing flooding as well, and reducing just the volume of runoff from that goes into storm drains. They're also great for improving water quality, which sort of ties into that stormwater runoff because they are filtering out those pollutants. It helps to protect things like our streams and rivers and lakes, and we do love lakes around here. They can also help with conserving water, especially in terms of capturing that water for irrigation. You won't ever have to water rain garden plants theoretically. So you can store that rainwater for later use. They can also really enhance aesthetics. Rain gardens are very beautiful and can add a really unique touch to your landscape. And you can get really creative with the species that you're adding into these rain gardens as well. And again, they're providing habitat for pollinators and wildlife. And something that's also great about them is they can really mitigate against sort of this like urban heat island effect by keeping an area cool and absorbing. They just are kind of a heat sink in a way. So there are features that our community conservation team actually installs a lot of these in urban environments, sort of for that very specific benefit, that in stormwater as well. Yeah, in terms of the soil mix, this is a question I get a lot. It's typically sort of 50 to 60% sand, and then 20 to 50%, or sorry, 20 to 30% topsoil with sort of like a low clay content, and then about 20 to 30% compost. So that's like the typical mix for a rain garden. And then they are always planted with native plants as well. But yeah, they're really awesome. And you can really think about, in terms of your property specifically, where is a good location for a rain garden, because they are going to be typically located in areas where they can capture that stormwater runoff, so that stormwater runoff is not, hitting impervious surfaces and then overwhelming some of our stormwater infrastructure. And if you'd like to read more, SCD has, again, another article about rain gardens, and I have some more resources at the end too, if people are interested in learning more. Cool. Now we're really going to get into native plant suggestions, as I promised. So in terms of what native plants are providing in terms of food, we're primarily going to be talking about seeds, berries, pollen, sap, nectar, and insects, which I include in here because of sort of that, call back to that statistic about how insects are primarily using native plants as places for shelter and nesting. And so that is providing a food resource in a way, especially for other wildlife like birds. So we'll start off talking about shrubs. I put this one first because it's one of my favorite. It's the red flowering currant. It's going to like conditions that are more full to part sun and can tolerate moist to dry soils. And they produce really beautiful pink flowers, like add such a beautiful pop of color into your yard. And bird species really love them, especially hummingbirds. They've got sort of that tubular shape in their flower. And then pollinators also are going to be very attracted to this beautiful shrub. An example of two evergreen shrubs is salal, and then our dole or short Oregon grape. We also have a tall Oregon grape as well. Both of these species are, like I mentioned, evergreen, and so they have, their green leaves year round. They also both produce very dark edible berries, very different flavors though. The Oregon grape is like super tart, and then the salal is like kind of mealy, but they're still good and still edible, which is great for wildlife, especially if you don't want to eat them. So wonderful food source in that way. Salal actually has really cool benefits in terms of its soil because it has this symbiotic relationship with ectomycorrhizal. And so really great for promoting soil health. They can really survive in actually very acidic soil as well. So if you have acidic soil, salal might be a great one. Any of the Ericaceae genus actually is going to be a really great option if you have acidic soil. Oregon grape, I always like to mention it because it is an early spring bloomer, and it produces really beautiful yellow flowers, but it's also a great alternative to common holly, an invasive species. So two shrubs to consider. Then I'd like to highlight roses. There's 3 here on the screen, but we have a few more natives, but the bald tip, nuka, and cluster rose are all lovely. They produce beautiful flowers, primarily pink, but sometimes some white flowers too. And they're going to grow more in full to partial sun and prefer moist soils. But the genus of Rosa is like pretty versatile. Um, they are going to be typically thicket forming as well. This is really great for things like birds, insects, and pollinators. All of them are going to really benefit from having, any sort of rose species, native rose species rather, around. And their rose hips are actually a really excellent food source because they're very high in vitamin C. So that's really specifically great for birds. Moving into talking about some trees, these are going to be 2 deciduous trees that are a little bit on the shorter side, our chokecherry and our Pacific crabapple. Both of these produce, as you can see from the pictures, some fruits, which are going to be really beneficial to wildlife. They both prefer to grow in more full sun and can tolerate partial shade as well. And they're going to prefer moist and well drained. The Pacific crabapple can actually also tolerate wetter soils as well. But these are really great and wonderful food source for birds and other wildlife specifically. And they get really lovely white flowers as well. In terms of some more trees rather, we have some conifers and then some bigger deciduous trees. Our conifers, we have Douglas fir, which is going to be our most tolerant to dry and droughty conditions. And then we have shore pine and western red cedar and Sitka spruce, which can all tolerate more wet, moist, wet, maybe a little more well draining would prefer, but definitely more moist soils. And then grand fir as well is a pretty versatile species. And these are all, again, conifers, so they have those evergreen needles. And they're great for providing things like shelter and habitat for wildlife, especially birds. In terms of our deciduous trees, sort of the big 5 here, the big leaf maple, red alder, and willow and cottonwoods, black cottonwoods rather, all 4 of these species are going to be able to tolerate more moist soil. Specifically, red alder, willow, and cottonwood are going to be able to tolerate wet soils. And then the Gary oak is going to be a great option if you have really dry soils, and all of which provide wonderful resources in terms of habitat and benefits for wildlife, and great shade as well. And again, you can think about other goals outside of wildlife, so things like privacy or just a beautiful place to enjoy some trees. Cool. Another spotlight is on goldenrods and asters. I already mentioned goldenrods on that plant phenology slide because they are a late season bloomer, but these 2 plants together are extra special because they are really a beacon for pollinators and even more specifically bees. There's been some pretty cool studies that have shown that when goldenrods and asters, specifically these purple asters, are planted together, they actually receive more pollination visits than if they were planted separately, which is pretty cool. I think if I remember correctly, part of it has to do with like the contrasting of colors is what attracts pollinators. And it just looks beautiful. So these are really superstars in that way. Great species to incorporate into your yard and especially a pollinator meadow. And these are also pretty common species to find in nurseries and especially seed packs as well, because they're very popular. Thinking about graminoids, so this is sort of an umbrella term for grasses, sedges, and rushes. There's a huge variety of different types of graminoids, and I've only just listed a few here. Northwest Meadowscapes, I've linked it again on this slide, has a lot of extensive information about native grasses and seeds. In terms of grasses specifically, we have the Festuca genus. There's things like Romer's fescue, red fescue, and Idaho fescue. These are all going to be more drought tolerant species, which is great. Same with the tufted hairgrass and bent grasses. Then we have our sedges. The Carex genus is one of the more common sedge species. Slough sedge is going to be one of the more tolerant of wet conditions, which is pretty cool. And then rushes are definitely our most wet tolerant of the graminoids. So Juncus is the genus. We have the common rush, toad rush, and creeping spike rush. And these are all going to really tolerate wet conditions as well. But there's just a huge variety of native grasses. And yeah, I definitely recommend checking out Northwest Meadowscapes for some more information on that. But these are great things to incorporate into your space. A lot of our pollinators, especially native bees, actually nest sort of at the base of bunch grasses specifically. So these are pretty cool in that way. Okay, thinking about sort of forbs and herbs and all of our beautiful ground covers, I have a few to highlight here. Oregon stonecrop, sedum is the genus, is a very cool one. It's almost got a little bit of a succulent sort of a texture to it, and it gets really, every species has like really cool flowers. This one specifically is Oregon stonecrop, has yellow flowers. They are very, very drought tolerant and they propagate super easily. Like just a little bit of water and they just take off, which is really cool. So they make a great ground cover in that way, and they're great for attracting pollinators. And specifically, I learned butterflies actually really like the nectar off this species. We also have blue-eyed grass. This is going to get beautiful, like purple flowers. They are going to prefer full to partial sun and more moist to wet soil conditions. This species is a great transition away from sort of traditional lawn while also attracting pollinators or traditional lawn species. And then kinnikinick, this is an evergreen species. Again, it's going to be keeping its leaves year round and is in the same family as salal. If you remember, I talked about it for the shrubs. This species is going to grow in full to partial sun, and it can really tolerate a pretty diverse array of soil conditions. So from dry to moist, and it produces really lovely white or pink flowers that are great for attracting birds, bees, and butterflies alike. So. Some more species, we have Pearly Everlasting. This is another one that you'll commonly find in wildflower mixes. It's a more of a drought tolerant flower that really prefers full sun and dry soils. It's got really long, sort of slender, really soft leaves and gets these really beautiful like white flowers on top. And pollinators love these. I think I am constantly in the spring and summer, especially the summer, seeing a lot of bees hopping around on these beautiful flowers. We also have lupin. There's a couple species. There's big leaf, and then there's also riverbank lupin. I have big leaf lupin pictured here, but both species are going to thrive in full sun and moist conditions. They are considered actually deer resistant, which I think is funny. I think most deer will eat anything, but theoretically, so the story is told that lupin are a pretty deer resistant species, but which is great, especially if you have deer problems, but they're also great for attracting things like bees and hummingbirds. And this is a great alternative to foxglove, which is a non-native species as well. They have very similar sort of like conical flower shapes and very, very interesting to look at. Overall, very unique flower. Another unique flower is our Pacific bleeding heart. This is going to be one of the most shade tolerant ground covers that produces, again, beautiful flowers. They have very rich nectar and can definitely provide a great food source for things like butterfly. Specifically, butterfly larvae actually will munch on the foliage. And so they sort of awesome for that. And they provide really excellent ground cover for amphibians and creating sort of a shady, cool environment for them. Moving on to some drought tolerant species. We've already talked about a few of these, but I'm just going to run through a few of them really quickly. These are going to be all species that once they're established are not going to need irrigation and going to be able to theoretically survive more of our hot, dry summers. So Douglas fir and shore pine are two that I already mentioned. Incense cedar is another that is technically non-native. Its range is more so in Northern California, but is one that is really being brought up into this area a lot more, specifically because it's drought tolerant. So one to consider. It's a beautiful cedar. Chokecherry and Garry oak, we also already chatted about. Garry oak is one of my most favorite deciduous trees that is drought tolerant. I highly recommend it if you can get your hands on some Garry oak. It's beautiful. Provides great, nuts as well. So awesome, rich food source. Nine bark, which is pictured, it's the top shrub with the white flowers on this slide, is a really beautiful species. It's very versatile. And again, it has those lovely white flowers. That's great for promoting, food sources and shelter for insects and pollinators and birds alike. Red flowering currant, I've already talked about, as well as kinnikinick. Oregon sunshine is that yellow flowered pictured at the bottom of the screen. It's one that's, again, very drought tolerant and beautiful pop of color as well, and one that you may find as well in wildflower mixes because it really does prefer full sun. And then Romer's fescue is that grass, that bunch grass pictured at the bottom. And again, very, very drought tolerant species all around here. And great additions to your yard, especially if you do not want to irrigate and or have very dry soil conditions. Another tolerance that's important to talk about is shade. I think that's a question I get a lot from people is they already have maybe matured vegetation or they have, their, position of their home is making it so that their yard doesn't get a lot of sun during the day. So a couple conifer species that are very shade tolerant is our western hemlock and our western red cedar. We also have vine maple, which is in the same genus as our big leaf maple, but much smaller. It's this beautiful picture here with like the red, orange, yellow, and green leaves. It adds like a wonderful like pop of fall color, a great addition to your yard. Very similar to Japanese maple in terms of look, if you really like the way Japanese maples look. We also have salal, which I already mentioned, and ocean spray. Ocean spray is a cool shrub and it actually retains its flowers year round. So, in the wintertime, they're more of like this like lovely like brown sort of like ghost flower. And then in the spring, you get new ones and they're beautiful white flowers. And they sort of like dangle down. It's a very very cool shrub. And then we have again our Oregon grapes already mentioned. They're very shade tolerant. Ferns are great species that will do really well, especially in moist, shady conditions. So we have our sword, deer, and maidenhair fern. Deer fern and maidenhair fern are sort of shown here on the screen and the top. And then wild ginger, this is actually the bottom two photos. This is one of my favorite species because it has such a crazy flower. And it's actually one that's pollinated by ants, which is pretty cool. This is a really low growing species and is a great option for a ground cover. Also evergreen, if I remember correctly, yes. And so it'll stay, green year round, adds a nice pop of color in the winter time. And then bleeding heart, also another one that I've mentioned that, yeah, is great in those shady, moist areas. Something to consider when you are choosing plant species is how you can create more of a layered canopy. By creating a layered canopy, you're creating more diversity in terms of habitat and creating niches for different types of species. So you really want to think about what's on your ground, what's in your middle to understory, what's in your overstory, and how can you create diversity in each of those layers. In general, when you're creating a layered canopy, you're also going to be having things like improved soil health and water retention. That water retention comes in more from the shade, so reduced evapotranspiration. And that improved soil health is just kind of by having a diversity of species, you have a diversity of root systems, and you're doing different types of nutrient cycling. So in general, increased diversity is increased health benefits, especially for soil. Something else that's something to consider is that by creating more of a layered canopy and increasing your diversity, you have more year-round beauty to enjoy. So like I mentioned, the vine maple, for example, has like beautiful fall colors. So that might be one that you want to incorporate because you can enjoy that throughout the fall season. Red osier dogwood is a plant that I really love in the wintertime because it has really red bark. So again, it adds that color. So something to enjoy, really thinking about when things are blooming and the colors that they're producing and, is it evergreen versus deciduous, all things to consider. And yeah, it can be a self-sustaining system. This sort of goes into the idea of enhancing biodiversity, increases health benefits, and reduce need for things like watering, fertilizer, and pesticides. Other things that you can do for wildlife in your yard include creating things like supplemental boxes. So this might include roosting platforms, bat boxes, insect hotels, bare ground, and mud. I really like to show the two bottom pictures because I think that this is really a good example of like choosing your own adventure. You can get as fancy as you want with it, or you can put some sticks in a tin cup and insects will use it. So that's pretty cool. You can get a little bit scrappy and DIY with what you're doing in your yard and creating some really awesome habitat for different types of wildlife, especially insects. Woody debris piles and brush piles are also a great way to help support insects because they will nest in there. We actually put in a very cool, not a roosting platform rather, but a raptor pole in one of our project sites, and got some really cool photos off of it. We're specifically using it for some vole control on a site, and we set up a wildlife camera. So that's something I would encourage you all to do if you have a little extra budget, setting up a wildlife camera, and especially if you have one of these supplemental boxes, you might get some really cool interactions with wildlife and get to enjoy that in a different way that you might not have if you didn't have these supplemental boxes. But this provides really great space for specifically like reproduction and nesting as well, and places to raise young, especially for birds. In terms of bare ground in mud, this might seem a little counterintuitive, but actually having smaller spaces where there is bare ground can be really beneficial because around 70% of our native bees actually nest in the ground. Bunch grasses can also sort of provide some of that environment as well. So consider adding area, especially in dry areas, adding some of these bunch grass species. And then butterflies do this really interesting behavior called puddling, where they're essentially sort of dipping their wings and their body into mud and puddling, and it helps cool them down. So yeah, considering that not everything needs to be fully covered and having some designated areas that you might keep as bare ground is a great idea. And when you mulch, especially, and you have shrubs, that kind of comes naturally. In terms of more chat on woody debris, snags, which are considered just standing dead trees, provide really amazing benefits for many, many different species, especially our cavity nesters. You'll see we have the pileated woodpecker here on this slide. And they can actually also then support other species as well. Some of our cavity nesters create those nests and then they leave and other species will move in. So it's a very cyclical sort of cycle in that way where you have a lot of different species using even just one standing dead tree and woody debris piles in general. In terms of food, this woody debris and these standing dead trees also are home to millions, and if not billions, of insects. And so that is creating a food source also for a lot of wildlife, especially birds. And these can also support things like amphibians as well, especially when you have things like brush and log piles. If you live in any sort of moist, shady area and have a brush pile during the winter, I mean, I bet if you turn them over, you're going to see some cool stuff for sure, if you're into insects and bugs and amphibians. Getting more now into some resources. These are some native plant nurseries that I really like to highlight. King Conservation District has this list of nurseries that are found in King County. This is a great place to start. King County also has this native plant nursery list as well, but then I also love to highlight our annual plant sale. Our plant sale is going to open up in January, so feel free to join our mailing list if you'd like some notifications about that. We boast a very beautiful and diverse array of species, primarily bare roots. But yeah, keep an eye out for that. And I like this King Conservation District because they also highlight the SCR Native Plant Nursery, which is where I used to work. So great resources there. I also want to highlight the National Wildlife Federation. They have two really cool programs. The first one is the Native Plant Finder. So this is a really cool tool where you can actually put in your specific location and you can get information on specific native plants to bring into your garden based off of your very localized spot. And same goes, you can actually look at specific, I believe it's butterflies only. Maybe they've expanded it also to other species. But you can actually find, if you want to support very specific butterflies, then you could link that to a specific native plant that then you can plant in your yard, which is pretty cool. So it's a little bit of a two-way street there where you can start with the plant or you can also start with the insect, and that's pretty cool. They also have their certified wildlife habitat program. This is sort of an online tool that you can do when you wanted to start this, if you want to start a journey of creating sort of wildlife habitat in your yard. You can join this community. It's a great place to share resources and to learn more. And there's an application fee, and then that gets you, certain benefits in terms of like that membership and, getting to say that also you're a part of this club of people who really love wildlife and want to continue to support them. But in general, National Wildlife Federation also just has great resources, and I encourage you to check them out. sort of on that note of checking things out, I would also encourage you to share this information forward. So keeping our waterways clean and healthy requires all of us. And uh, being here today to help support the behavior change campaign is, I think, amazing. It's such a cool program or to be a part of and to be able to help raise awareness about it. So please like take the pledge to protect our waters. I think that link already went around, but maybe we can put it back up in case you missed it in the beginning. And really, I would encourage you to check out the behavior change toolkit, which lists all of the BMPs for how to, naturally manage your yards and gardens. Many of which we talked about today, but it was a lot of information. So maybe you need to review. And also just share this webinar. It'll be posted on the SED's YouTube channel, which I have a photo of here. But yeah, I think that the impact can be multiplied so much just by you sharing this out and, participating in this awesome campaign. And then I have a few more resources listed here. I'll read through them and I won't say too much because they're pretty self-explanatory, just for people to like take photos and, take notes. But UW Master Gardeners and UW Extension has great resources on mulching and guides to soil health. Snohomish County has an alternative to lawns guide that is pretty thorough and lays out some really nice step-by-step instructions. Snohomish County also has this rainscaping guide, and this resource list under the rainscaping sort of info is an insane resource list that has like almost every topic that you could want. So I really recommend, maybe we can even send out that resource list potentially. We'll have to talk to Danny or Taylor about that. Might be overpromising. But Growing Healthy Soils is another resource off that rainscaping guide that is one of my favorites. In terms of more resources on native plants, we have Washington Plant Societies to check out. National Wildlife Federation, which I mentioned. OSU Extension has a great article on shrubs and trees specifically for bees if you're interested in learning more. SED, like I mentioned, I think throughout this, we have some great articles like the rain garden one, as well as some others specifically focused on wetland and riparian plants and plants for bank stabilization and erosion. If you need help with invasive species, I really recommend reaching out to your county. If you live in Snohomish County, that would be, of course, Snohomish County, but you can also reach out to Snohomish Conservation District. And then Washington Noxious Weed Control Board is another great resource. And then finally, these are some more fun ones. If you want to learn more about wildlife and pollinators, WDFW, Department of Fish and Wildlife, has great resources. And then these are unfortunately just links. Perhaps these can be sent out as well to participants, but I have some specific resources on things like beavers and salmon. Xerces Society is a great resource if you're really interested in bees. Same goes for any Heather Holmes book. She has some amazing, amazing books about bees and pollinators if you're interested in learning more. And then I have some more links to some information on water and garden designs. And then some fun additional info. These are just like some cool documentaries and articles that I think are just like fun reads. And a few of them actually reference some of the statistics that I talked about in this presentation. So yeah, with that, I will maybe turn it back over to Danny to talk about this post-workshop survey.
That was a wonderful presentation. Thank you, Paisley. And we can definitely send out those resources with a follow-up email. So if you all wouldn't mind filling out this post-workshop survey, I'm going to go ahead and post the link in the chat as well. So please do fill this out just so that way we can, learn if you all learned something tonight. And the answer is hopefully yes. So we're going to give it like a minute or so. And while you're filling that out, Taylor, did you have anything you wanted to say?
Yeah, no, really great presentation, Paisley. Appreciate your time. Yeah, so I'm just gonna grab a few things too that I can add to the presentation because I have some good experience in some low impact green stormwater infrastructure work and done it outside, and then I've implemented it in my own house also. So another mulch that I recommend folks looking into and using, which is pretty readily available in the area, is something called ox fuel or animal-friendly hogs fuel. It's a really great one. We like to use in gardens with landscaping. Then when it comes to sod removal work, just a FYI, the sod cutters are somewhat of a beast to use. We use quite a few of them in different models, sizes, and they're definitely worth it for somebody young enough to get a full day's workout in a few minutes. But the tried and true method is what Paisley had said, was shovel, kind of digging it down. And what I like to do is like kind of doing like one by one grid squares, kind of taking them out one by one that way. It's kind of satisfying, and it's kind of lessens the work we're doing. But yeah, it was a great presentation, covered a lot of information. We'll try to implement a lot of these links into the resource pages that we'll provide on the pledge form and for the toolkit. So kind of look out for that. Again, thanks to SCD for all this.
Yeah.
Thank you, Taylor. And yes, please do check out that Pledge to Protect page and the City of Lake Stevens page as well, where you can follow the I Love Lake campaign. And thank you to the City of Lake Stevens for co-hosting and sponsoring this webinar with us. We love partnering with them, and they're all amazing. And you can find Shannon, Olin, and Taylor's information on here if you do want to reach out to the City of Lake Stevens for any reason, if you have any questions or you want to learn more about the behavior change program. And
Yeah, I would just like to add to the round of thank yous to everybody, for Danny for organizing, for Taylor for bringing up the opportunity and really leading this charge. Like Danny said, it's really wonderful to partner with you all and see the amazing work that you're doing. And I just put my information up here again, my email and phone number. Feel free to reach out with more questions if you have them.
And we do have a few questions in the question and answer section.
Great.
So let's see. Kevin says, some very nice options for lawn replacement options. I live outside Seattle, and unfortunately, I really need shade, partial shade options, specifically lawn replacement.
Okay. So asking for a specific species for,
Yes,
gotcha.
for shade and partial shade, looks like.
Gotcha. I'm just gonna go back to my shade tolerant slide. Sorry, that was probably a little bit chaotic for everyone online. Um, looking for specifically ground cover as well.
It doesn't, let's see, for shade, partial shade option, specifically lawn replacement. So yeah, I think that could be good.
Okay. Yeah. So I think one of my favorites that's on this slide specifically is going to be that wild ginger. It's going to be very shade tolerant and a good ground cover. Um, And I think when you, especially if you're removing sod and mulching, part of the great part about like having that shaded area is that it doesn't need to be fully covered with a ground cover as well. So like leaving area of bare ground is great. And then you can incorporate species like ferns would be another great one. So you can still have some of that greenery, but it's just not 100% plants essentially everywhere like you would typically get with a lawn. Um, if that sort of makes sense for for everyone. Yeah, let's see what else. There's definitely certain like uh grasses as well that I think would do well, but most of our native grass species are going to be a little bit less shade tolerant. I'm just thinking about like for more ground cover. It's sort of hard to like toe that line of um yeah, ground cover and also shade tolerant. Um, we definitely have some low growing species. So things like sweet woodruff would be another one. There's like this gallium, I believe is the genus. There's a few different species of that, which will definitely spread around. Bunchberry is another one that's more of a ground cover. It's in the dogwood family. Um, and let's see. Oh, Solomon seal is another beautiful one. It's definitely a ground cover, but it does kind of grow up a little bit as well. Um, yeah, those are the ones that initially come to mind that are super shade tolerant. Unfortunately, also I'm thinking of way more like scientific names. For some reason, it's harder for me to come up with the common names. Um, I'm thinking of Myanthemum as a genus as well. But I'm blanking on what the common name is for that. Maybe I can like look it up really quickly. My hand.
Got you. False lily of the
False lily of the
valley.
valley. Thank you.
And
Yeah,
then
false lily of the valley
another,
and false Solomon seal. Yeah.
yeah, and another good one is wood sorrel. It's
Oh,
a really
wood sorrel
great
is a beautiful
spreading
one.
ground
Mhm.
cover. Does really well shade too.
Yeah, that's a great one. Thanks.
Huckleberries.
Oh yeah,
Um,
huckleberries, but I feel like that's a little less
usually a good,
ground cover. It's a little more shrubby.
yeah,
But
good shade shrub.
yes, yes, great shade shrub. Great. And you get delicious berries off of it too. Yeah. It's salmonberry, actually, speaking of another actually shade tolerant uh, species with great berries.
Awesome. Thank you, Paisley and Taylor.
Mhm.
Kevin also asked for a link to the native plant sale. So I went ahead and posted that in the chat as well. So if you're curious, you can find the link to our SCD plant sale. It allows you to also sign up for our plant sale mailing list, which will also help keep you up to date on all of the information for that. And the next question is, Paisley, did you have a slide with a tree above a red currant? Because somebody's saying, what is the tree above or with the red currant?
Oh, let's
It's like a
go.
scavenger hunt.
Yeah, it is a little scavenger hunt. Let's see. I think the red currant was on maybe my first slide.
I just saw it. You passed it. I think it
Oh, I
was a
did?
Pacific Madrone
You got a good eye, Taylor. Where did you see that?
right there.
Oh, here. Oh, yes, that is a Pacific Madrone. Oh, thank you for bringing this up because this is one of my favorite trees. The Pacific Madrones are wonderful. They're actually very tolerant to like really dry soils, and they're really great for soil stabilization. They're actually an evergreen. So they retain their leaves year round, and they have the most beautiful red sort of peely bark. Um, and they're pretty slow growing, but they grow in like very cool shapes, and very, very artistic. Yes, thanks for pointing that out, and thanks for helping me find the picture, Taylor.
And Stephanie also said, thank you. It was fun to learn together as a family and talk through which plants were our favorites. So that's
Mm,
adorable. Thank you,
that's awesome.
Stephanie. All right. And then GE asks, great presentation. Will it be available online? Yes, it will be. We will be posting it in a few days, likely on our YouTube channel. And then it might also possibly be posted um, on Lake Stevens as well, but definitely on our YouTube channel. All you have to do is go on YouTube and look up Snohomish Conservation District, and you'll easily find us. And they also shared their story, my landscape story. My red flowering currant didn't survive a dusty mildew attack, but luckily it produced a volunteer plant on my neighbor's side of the fence, so I'm still able to enjoy the birds and bees who enjoy this plant species.
Oh, well, I'm so happy that you got a volunteer out of it. Yeah, that's lovely. Thank you for sharing.
Thank you, GE. And then Kate asks, any good plants for a yard with pets, clover, grasses, something that will be good even when peed and pooped on?
Ooh, that's a great question. Let me just think for a moment. Mm, I think
That's a tough one to answer.
it is a tough
I
one.
have
Yeah.
dogs and I have a native landscape out back. I have a dedicated like green space grass for them. But the surrounding area is all mulch landscape, logs and native plants. Uh, Shrubs tend to do better when protected early on. Um, just it's that initial protection that I see needed, the first year, kind of wrapping something around it to keep the dogs out. And then once things get established, they do pretty well. Oregon irises seem to do
Hmm.
well. Penstemons, coneflowers, once they get going, they usually do pretty well. Dogs.
Yeah. I'm also thinking about like toxicity, and I know that like honeysuckle rather, and goldenrods and like coneflowers and bee balm are all like safe for pets, and same with roses, and actually maybe even especially thinking about that protection aspect you brought up, Taylor, like maybe thinking about maybe some shrubs that have some thorns on them just to keep the your pets away. Just like adds a little bit of a layer of protection. They kind of know, oh, like maybe I shouldn't go next to that shrub. Might help them in the long run. Yeah, I'm trying to think about what else. I know milkweed is very toxic, which is unfortunate because it's great for monarchs, but
Yeah,
it def
echinaceas and black-eyed Susans, those kind of
oh yeah.
are definitely kind of watch out for dogs. They don't usually go after them, but like always kind of be careful.
Yeah.
Dogs like grasses, so if you plant some native tuft grass or things like that, they usually like to chew on it and helps their stomach out sometimes.
Mm.
Awesome, thank you. It looks like that is all for right now. Does anyone have any more questions they'd like to put in the chat? That was a lot of good engagement, though. We might be good to go on questions. Nothing else is coming in. All
Cool. Well,
right.
thank you for all the questions. Last time I did a webinar, I got no questions and I was really sad. So that was awesome.
All right. Well, thank you everybody for joining us tonight. We loved having you. Paisley, is there any other final words you want to say before we close this out?
I just thank you for everyone who showed up and stayed and engaged. I really appreciate it. And then again, another big thanks to Taylor and Danny for all your organizing and hard work. I really appreciate it.
Thanks
Thank
for
you.
watching, everybody.